The lights were brighter than ever that year. Everywhere you looked in 1996, there was Tupac Shakur. On the radio, on TV, on magazine covers. He wasn't just a rapper anymore. He was becoming something bigger, something almost untouchable. His double album, All Eyes on Me, was dominating the charts. His presence filled every room. And for a moment, it felt like nothing could stop him. But behind that rise, something didn't feel right. In his music, in his interviews, even in the way he carried himself, there was a shadow, a quiet, persistent awareness of death. Not fear, but familiarity, as if he had already seen the ending long before the rest of the world caught up. And then came the moment that, in hindsight, feels almost impossible to ignore. In one of his videos, Tupac staged his own death. At the time, it looked like art, a dramatic choice, a creative risk. But just weeks later, it wouldn't feel like acting anymore. So the question is, how does a man at the very top of the world end up losing everything at just 25? Was Tupac destroyed by the streets, by the industry, or by a role he could never escape? To understand that, we have to go back to where the story really begins. Tupac Shakur. Before the fame, before the headlines, there was a child born into a war he didn't choose. Tupac Shakur entered the world surrounded by tension, surveillance, and resistance. His mother, Afeni Shakur, wasn't just a parent, she was a revolutionary, a leading member of the Black Panther Party. She had stood in court, pregnant with him, defending herself against charges that could have put her away for life. And somehow, she won. But even victory came with a cost. From the very beginning, Tupac's life was shaped by a quiet but constant pressure. The sense that the system was always watching, always waiting. FBI surveillance, financial instability, moving from place to place. Nothing ever felt permanent. Nothing ever felt safe. And then there was the absence. Tupac grew up without a consistent father figure. His stepfather was on the run. His biological father was nowhere to be found. So his mother became everything: protector, teacher, and emotional anchor. But even she was fighting her own battles, trying to hold the family together in a world that never seemed to give them a break. Imagine growing up like that, always aware, always alert, always carrying a weight you don't fully understand yet. And still, Tupac was different. He wasn't the toughest kid on the block. He wasn't the athlete everyone admired. In a time when heroes were defined by physical dominance, Tupac stood out for something else entirely: his sensitivity, his curiosity, his ability to feel deeply in a world that often punished exactly that. And that made him a target. But it also made him an artist. When he arrived at the Baltimore School of the Arts in the mid-1980s, something shifted. For the first time, Tupac wasn't just surviving, he was discovering who he could become, surrounded by creativity, expression, and discipline. He found a place where he didn't have to pretend. And then, he found Shakespeare. There was something about the rhythm, the emotion, the raw human truth in those words that spoke directly to him. It wasn't just literature, it was power. It was a way to take everything he had lived through and turn it into something meaningful, something that could be heard. In that space, Tupac wasn't a product of struggle, he was possibility. But even then, life was already preparing to pull him back, because just as he began to find himself, he was forced to make a choice that would change everything. Stay and build a future, or leave and protect the only family he had. And for Tupac, there was never really a choice at all. Leaving Baltimore wasn't just a physical move, it was the moment Tupac stepped out of a world that understood him and back into one that demanded something else. When he arrived in California, the environment felt familiar, but harsher. The streets moved faster. The expectations were different. Survival wasn't just emotional anymore. It was social. It was economic. It was visible, at first. Music became his way in. Joining Digital Underground gave Tupac his first real platform. He wasn't the star yet, but you could already see it. The energy, the presence. That feeling that when he spoke, people leaned in just a little closer. Because Tupac didn't just rap, he told stories. And those stories came from a place most people were too afraid or too disconnected to talk about. Then came Brenda's Got a Baby, a song about a 12-year-old girl, abandoned, abused, and invisible to the system around her. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't designed for radio hits, but it hit something deeper. It forced people to listen, and more importantly, to feel. That was Tupac's real power. Not just talent, but truth. At a time when America was facing rising tension around race, policing, and inequality, Tupac became more than an artist. He became a voice, a translator of pain, someone who could take complex, uncomfortable realities and turn them into something undeniable. And then, reality came for him. In 1991, after being stopped by police in Oakland, Tupac was brutally beaten, not in a song, not in a metaphor, in real life. For the first time, everything he had been speaking about wasn't just observation, it was personal. The injustice, the anger, the feeling of being disrespected and unseen. It all became real in a way that changed him. He sued the police department, and he won. But something else shifted too, because after that moment, Tupac wasn't just telling stories about the struggle anymore. He was living it. And as his first album went gold, and his influence continued to grow, so did the expectations around him. People didn't just want truth anymore. They wanted authenticity. And in the world Tupac was stepping into, authenticity came with a dangerous price. You couldn't just speak about the streets, you had to prove you belonged to them. That's when the line between artist and identity began to blur. And once that line disappears, it's almost impossible to find your way back. At some point, the message started to change. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but slowly, almost quietly. After the beating in Oakland, something hardened inside Tupac. The same man who once used poetry to expose pain was now beginning to carry that pain differently, more openly, more aggressively. And the world noticed. Tupac introduced the idea of thug life, not just as a phrase, but as a philosophy. To him, it wasn't about glorifying crime. It was about survival, about understanding the desperation that pushed people into choices they never wanted to make. But that message didn't stay pure. Because the more Tupac talked about the streets, the more people expected him to live like the streets. And that's where everything started to shift. In 1993, after an altercation in Atlanta, Tupac shot 2 off-duty police officers. He later claimed it was self-defense, and the charges were dropped. But the impact was already there. The headlines, the narrative, the image. He wasn't just speaking against violence anymore, he was at the same time. Political pressure was building. The Vice President of the United States publicly condemned his music, blaming it for influencing crime. Media outlets painted him as dangerous, a symbol of everything that was going wrong. And the more they attacked him, the more he leaned into that identity. Because in that environment, backing down didn't look like growth. But the real breaking point came later that same year. In November 1993, Tupac was accused of sexual assault in a New York hotel room. He denied the allegations completely, insisting he had been set up. But the damage was immediate. Roles disappeared. Opportunities vanished. His reputation shifted overnight. For the first time, Tupac wasn't just fighting the system, he was fighting perception. Then, in 1994, things escalated even further. He was shot multiple times inside a recording studio in New York. 5 bullets. Close range. He survived, but barely. And in his mind, it wasn't random. It was betrayal. Friends. Industry connections. People he trusted. After that, the paranoia wasn't just emotional. It was constant. Every room. Every conversation. Every glance. Who's real? Who's not? And just one day after that shooting, Tupac walked into court and was convicted, sentenced to prison, stripped of everything he had built. Fame, freedom, control, gone. By the age of 24, Tupac Shakur had become exactly what the world feared, and exactly what it expected. A revolutionary voice, turned into a controversial figure, trapped in a life that was spiraling faster than he could control. And for the first time, he had nowhere left to run. Prison didn't just take Tupac off the streets, it stripped everything down to who he really was. Away from the noise, away from the cameras, away from the expectations, something unexpected happened. The anger softened, the performance faded, and what remained was a version of Tupac that very few people had ever truly seen. In letters, in poems, in quiet moments, he opened up. Not as a rapper, not as a symbol, but as a human being. He spoke about regret, about confusion, about the weight of being misunderstood. There was vulnerability in his words, honest, unfiltered, and almost fragile. The kind of honesty that didn't fit the image the world had built around him. And maybe for the first time in years, he started thinking about a different life. He talked about writing scripts, about building something for young people, about giving back in a way that didn't require violence, or fear, or performance. There was even a sense that he wanted to step away from the thug life identity altogether. But the world outside wasn't waiting for him to change. It was waiting for him to return. And when the opportunity came, it didn't come from a place of freedom. It came with a price. Suge Knight, the head of Death Row Records, offered to pay Tupac's bail, over $1 million, to get him out of prison. But in return, Tupac had to sign a deal. Multiple albums, full commitment, no real way out. It looked like rescue, but it was a contract. And once Tupac walked out of prison, he didn't step into a new beginning. He stepped into a system that needed him to be exactly who he had been trying to leave behind. Under death row. The music changed. The tone became darker, more aggressive, more focused on revenge, loyalty, and power. The industry loved it. The sales exploded. Tupac was bigger than ever, but inside, the conflict was still there. Because now, the entire world wasn't just watching Tupac Shakur. They were depending on him to stay the same. And when millions of people believe in a version of you, walking away from it isn't just difficult, it feels impossible. By 1996, Tupac Shakur had everything most people spend a lifetime chasing: money, fame, influence, power. But underneath it all, there was a growing sense that something wasn't right. He was working non-stop, releasing music at an almost impossible pace, surrounded by people, noise, and expectation. And yet, those closest to him began to notice something different. He was thinking about leaving, not just the label, but the lifestyle. There were plans to step away from death row, plans to return to acting, even conversations about going back to Shakespeare, the same art form that once made him feel free, long before the world told him who he had to be. And then, there was love. His relationship with Kidada Jones brought a sense of calm that had been missing for years. For the first time in a long time, Tupac wasn't just surviving, he was imagining a future, a real one. But the past doesn't always let go that easily. On the night of September 7th, 1996, in Las Vegas, everything changed. After a boxing match, Tupac got into an altercation with a member of the Crips. It was quick, intense, the kind of moment that, in that world, never really ends when it's over. Hours later, sitting in a car with Suge Knight, Tupac was shot multiple times in a drive-by shooting. 6 days later, he was gone, 25 years old. And just like that, one of the most powerful voices of a generation fell silent. To this day, no one has been officially held accountable. And the question still lingers: who killed Tupac? But maybe the deeper question is this: was it one night in Las Vegas? Or was it a series of choices, pressures, expectations, and identities that slowly closed in around him? Because Tupac wasn't just a rapper. He was a poet, a thinker, a man who felt deeply in a world that often demanded hardness. In the end, he didn't just live a life, he performed one. And maybe he performed it too well. So what do you think? Could Tupac have changed the world if he had walked away in time? Or was his fate already written long before that final night? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you see Tupac differently, stay with me for the next one.